inside the depths of stone. Voice will echo, need no phone. Ruled by the laws above. Nature shows me, makes me taught. I could climb this mountain now, rise above the clouds and see where oh the falls that kept me strong. Never did I mean no wrong, 'cause I ain't looking back. I ain't looking back. Ain't looking, ooh, ain't looking back. Ain't looking, yeah. Ain't looking back. Ain't looking, ooh, ain't looking back. Oh, ain't looking back. Ooh, ain't looking back. Ain't looking back. Ain't looking back. Ain't looking back. Ain't looking back.
Please take your seats. The program will begin in 10 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes.
By the lights, we came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in the night. We bring the vibes here. We full of life, you keep the change, keep the change. They hate and say we went and changed. I say the same. You must be blinded by the lights. You must be blinded by the lights, lights. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Some faith that who gon' hurt this. I naughty night you lullaby. I'm doing me, it's do or die. You must be blinded by the lights. We came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in the night. We bring the vibes here. We full of life, you keep the change, keep the change. They hate and say we win and change. Why stay the same? You must be blinded by the light.
No, we don't need to choose between climate goals and growth. For many companies, the answer is to go green and grow. Where is the opportunity to create new businesses in some of the new technologies and new industries that we will need to reach net zero? Why not your company be the company scaling these new technologies and taking them to the new commercial levels that we haven't seen before?
Please welcome to the stage Meg Szabo, Head of Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events, and Nicola Porter, Executive Editor of Bloomberg Media Studios.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a great lunch, got something to eat, got to do a little networking. We have a great afternoon ahead of a wide range of topics from climate policy to how to save the oceans to sustainable fashion. But before we get back into it, just a couple of quick reminders. We want to hear from you today. You can use our hashtag on social media, hashtag Bloomberg Green. And you can submit all of your questions and answer some live polls using the QR code behind me. So I encourage you right now to get your phones out because Nicola has a little something fun for us all to do.
Thank you so much. I'll just start that again. Please do get your phones out because in the interest of hearing from our wonderful audience here, we've got a live polling question that's being brought to you by McKinsey Sustainability. Now, all you have to do is scan the QR code behind me and answer the following question. Is your company currently adopting new technologies that will enable climate goals to be reached? Now, you can answer yes, no, planning to, or not planning to. So please do get voting.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think climate tech is obviously, it's an area that we cover at Bloomberg Green. It is something that is emerging as really important, whether it be a new innovative technology or updating old technologies and advancing them a little bit further. So I'm really curious to see. We also we had a great carbon capture session earlier. We have an AI session coming up. So
absolutely,
it's obviously very, very important right now.
And BNF is really tracking climate technology investments. And we did see a bit of a slump earlier this year, but we're seeing a big uptick in that this year. And the end of last year, we saw actually climate tech investment reaching parity with fossil fuel investments. It was over $1 trillion. So it definitely looks like the climate tech investment landscape is going in the right direction.
And also, to just preview that we have Ali Zaidi is about to come into the stage, White House climate advisor. And as we all know, the IRA has done a lot to influence that and get climate technologies invested in. So that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. So please do get voting. We are seeing the results are going to be coming in any second here. Oh, look. Wow.
Wow, 84%.
That's very impressive.
That is it's not even a question.
I mean, this is great. I'm very happy to see that green line is there in, such a big way because we know that climate technology is going to play a huge role in decarbonizing existing infrastructure. And also, we know that climate technology needs to be, at 2030, the climate technology exists to get us through to 2030, but actually beyond that we need to really scale up, so it's fantastic to see. So thank you very much everybody for voting. That was brought to you by McKinsey Sustainability, and Meg, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nicola. Thank you all. So with that, let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Ali Zaidi, White House Climate Advisor, to the stage with Bloomberg's Jennifer Deloli.
Please welcome to the stage Ali Zaidi, National Climate Advisor at the White House, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jennifer A. Deloli.
All right, here we are.
Ali, thanks for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure.
I am so excited to be talking to you today because, of course, you're at the apex of, I think, everything the Biden administration is doing on climate policy across the entire federal government. And you just had a really big win with the methane emission rule that came out of the EPA. Clearly, that's one of the biggest efforts to go after oil and gas emissions of methane. Significant 3-year achievement.
Yeah.
That only takes care of, well, let me just say, you've obviously got some more waiting in the wings, right? You have the power plant rule. You're going to be going after emissions from power plants and from tailpipes. The EPA is working to finalize those. I appreciate, by the way, that gets us to the sectors responsible for about 53% of US greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, there's plenty more to go after, and the job is far from done. The agriculture and industrial sectors, for instance, they're responsible for 34% of emissions. You know, more than a decade ago, the EPA bound itself up in a legal settlement saying it would impose oil industry emission limits on refineries. That job has not been done. When is the US government going to get serious and go after the agriculture emissions, the refinery emissions, the industrial sector emissions?
Well, first of all, earlier this week we rolled out the methane rule from the EPA, which on its own is projected to reduce emissions in 2030 by 130 million metric tons. Just to put that in perspective, that's about 2% of US emissions. So when we say we're going to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030, our nationally determined contribution, that's a big chunk of what we have remaining to get to that goal. In the same breath, though, that came with a whole host of other actions to tackle methane in other parts of the economy, from food waste, from landfills, from abandoned mines and orphaned wells. We're capturing it all. And I think that's the approach we're taking to every sector of the economy. So these rules end up being very, I think, central to broad, multi-pronged strategies to take on the challenge. On the industrial and the agricultural sector, I think they are core parts of our trajectory to get to a net zero economy. And we've made very significant progress. In the agriculture sector, we now have 25 million acres in the United States, 60,000 farms that are signed up for climate smart agriculture practices under the Biden administration. And as part of that, we're actually developing these really robust value chains where folks all along the development of a product are being able to capture the value from climate smart practices. That's a really big deal. On the industrial sector, we actually are doing regulatory work of a few different kinds. The first is the EPA is now, for the first time, setting up protocols around the measurement of embodied carbon in these materials, EPDs, environmental product declarations, that will, I think, proliferate in the marketplace and facilitate the formation of capital around the deploying of cleaner materials. Our General Services Administration, which buys all this stuff for the federal government, is actually now has rules on the book to define lower carbon and low carbon materials in the key elements of cement, steel, asphalt, and flat glass. So I think there's regulatory activity that is ongoing, and there's stuff that we're going to need to do in the coming decade and that follows to get the job done.
Mm-hmm. You also have, obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act has unleashed a lot more activity in the offshore wind sector. You've had lease sales, the administration has approved 6 projects, and yet you're also clearly seeing the industry grappling with some serious obstacles from the inflation, from the higher cost of borrowing, from supply chain woes. Ørsted pulled back 2 of its projects. Equinor, BP have yanked projects as well. We're dealing with the repercussions of that. The president set out a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity installed by the end of the decade, but Vestas has said, we don't think that's possible. Analysts from BNEF, from Clearview Energy, from other outlets have said, not possible. It's a pipe dream, one of them said. What do you know that they don't?
Number one, I think folks are glossing over the fundamentals in this market. But before I get to that, let me just say a word about the analysts. Everyone you just rattled off, when we set our goal to sell 50% clean vehicles in 2030, told us we were off by at least a factor of 2, maybe a factor of 3. Today, we are in a position where the United States has announced 15 gigafactories worth of production that will lead to 13 million EVs worth of batteries in 2030. We normally sell 15, 16 million vehicles. Folks can do the math and tell me if the analysts were right or wrong. But here's the thing on offshore wind, not to be glib. Number one, the projects that you listed off that are facing some economic headwinds, non-trivial ones, are ones that had locked in contracts from prior to the shifts in the economic situation. So they had already gone to vessel providers or turbine and nacelle providers and locked in a price before the fluctuation took place. Second, they were the front edge, and so they bid very aggressively and locked in their power offtake at a very, call it bargain basement price at the time even. And then on top of that, they designed the financing for those projects for no fault of their own. This is how you finance infrastructure of this kind in a way that was highly sensitive to interest rates. And so all of those things come together to put real pressure and discipline around this first set of projects, which, by the way, are uniformly facing these challenges, but not uniformly folding, right? You've got the largest of these projects, Dominion Energy, which is going to come in at the low end of their LCOE, 92% hedge, and it's going to deliver on time. A number of other projects in the New York and New Jersey area, Massachusetts also advancing as well. But when you look at the second round, you will have the product and the benefit of the supply chains that are now in construction that will be available. You will have the benefit of this learning from financing this first round of projects that will benefit. You will have the benefit of transmission infrastructure, backboning, that's being built out right now as we speak. Those things will help cut the cost down. And I think if you take that plus the project pipeline, which is 50 gigawatts, you marry those two things together, I'm feeling pretty good about being bullish on our ability to meet our goals.
Fair enough, although I would note the Dominion Energy project is a vastly differently structured project than some of the others we're seeing at the very beginning.
Yeah, look, I think we're going to learn about the value of the partners in these JVs. We're going to learn about the nature of the structure of escalators within this, whether it's based on a bundle of goods or key supply chain costs. And I think there's going to be more pressure to find cost-saving opportunities through shared infrastructure, like transmission backboning.
Well, let me ask you about one of the most pressing issues that's going to be unfolding and debated over the COP, which is what we do about fossil fuels and their future, whether we phase them out, or phase them down, or do something else. The U.S. has supported versions of both constructions, phase out and phase down in the past. But at the same time, back home, the U.S. is presiding over surging oil and gas production. We're seeing new development and new fields opened up on federal waters and on federal lands. How do you square? I mean, the U.S. credibility is on the line. If you're supporting phase out or even phase down here at the COP, but you go back home and you're presiding over this tremendous production, how do you square those two?
I think the temporal question is an important one, right? I think you're pointing to some of the facts that you laid out are point-in-time facts that match decisions that were made a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. I think we do need to attach a great deal of stress testing and scrutiny to decisions that will lock us into one future or another 10, 15 years out. And I think you're seeing that take place in this administration, which really for the first time is doing pioneering analysis on the climate implications of projects and other matters on a go-forward basis. Look, we've had a very clear negotiating position in the G7 context and the G20. We hope to build on that. We need to put fossil fuel emissions in the rearview mirror. And the way we do that is not just by deploying clean, but also being very skeptical about long life infrastructure that leaves a big hangover years from now. You pointed to, I don't want to gloss over the hard stuff, right? You pointed to leasing that's taken place, some in part because of mandates from legislation that was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. We are a rule of law administration. We follow the law. We will implement the legislation. But that wasn't in our initial volley over to the Congress. And then some as a result of decisions that were made decades ago that have built up a considerable amount of reliance interest and legal record. But here's the thing, and this does go, I think, to maybe an explanatory point that's important to make. In the United States, the political economy around traveling forward on climate, on accelerating progress on decarbonization, on the work of environmental justice, on the work of worker empowerment, it's not a given. It's not obvious that we absolutely stay on this trajectory. It's something we have to be diligent about, deliberate, focused on reinforcing. And, you know, just to give you an example, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think has been a runaway success, there have been as many votes to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act as there were the ACA at this time in terms of pace and trajectory. So there are folks who just don't believe in this transition. And they're indulging a climate denial that the rest of us just can't afford to do.
I believe we are out of time. Such a short conversation. But thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Ali.
Thanks, Lynn.
Please welcome to the stage Sally Fouts, global leader at the Climate Pledge, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Nicola Porter.
Hi, Sally. Thank you so much for joining us here. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump straight in. This COP28, has promised to be the most inclusive COP. And part of that is engagement of the private sector. We know that the private sector is absolutely critical in order to reach climate goals and to move fast enough. From your very specific vantage point, do you think that you, Amazon, the Climate Pledge, is doing enough to really try and make those climate goals work?
Yeah, you know, it's a tricky question, right? Because we're playing catch up at this point. So doing enough is a hard thing to answer. But I feel privileged to be in the position of working with now more than 450 companies that have signed up to the Climate Pledge and getting the opportunity to hear what they're doing, you know, every single day and the work that they're doing across sectors and in different geographies of the world. And so, you know, speaking on behalf of Amazon, I would say, you know, we are sprinting in many, many areas, and so are the companies that are signed up to the pledge. And It gives me a lot of hope and optimism, but I'm not sure there would be a world right now where you could be going fast enough, right? So, but I do have a lot of optimism.
From your very unique vantage point, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges and obstacles that businesses are facing as they're working to navigate their way through their sustainability journey?
Yeah, there are obviously a lot of obstacles, right? Anyone in the room who works for a business that is trying to decarbonize, any of its parts of business, whether it's scope 1 or scope 3 or what have you, there are many challenges, but I think one of them that I find that's fairly universal with the companies that I talk with is this desire as a private sector business to do kind of what we typically do, which is move fast, deploy capital, innovate, create new solutions, combined with the need to also, monitor and navigate this new world of disclosures that are coming and some ambiguity around, methodologies and pieces of that puzzle that are still largely missing. And I hear about that a lot from companies that, we want to go fast. We know what the solutions are in some cases, not all, and we want to be able to, sprint at those things, but we're not really sure how to account for them or what the methodology will look like if we do it this way. And so I think, I would love to see us come together in some way, shape, or form to give that level of detail and let companies move forward and move out of the sort of swirl of wondering what's coming in terms of how they're going to be reporting on things, and really just dig in and do the work.
And that must also come down to this, the public-private collaboration there, where you've got the policy and the regulation needs to be in place, to allow companies to do what they can do best, which is move fast, try new things, see if it works or not. Are you seeing amongst your signatory companies that there is greater collaboration across that public-private partnership?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons for the Climate Pledge is collaboration, is a recognition that a company can't reach net zero carbon emissions but in its own four walls. So you need other companies in the private sector and in your value chain. You also need government and policymakers to open some doors, enable businesses to do some of the things that they need to do. So I can give one example of a project that we're working on within the Climate Pledge. We've recently announced at New York Climate Week that we're partnering with C40 Cities, which is a nonprofit organization, to decarbonize middle mile transport in 5 cities in Latin America and 2 in India. And that's a recognition that we need to be working within those cities. Those cities need infrastructure, they need resources on the ground, and so absolutely there would be no world in which a business would be able to implement the things that it needs to implement without government also coming along.
And tackling hard-to-abate sectors like shipping, like transportation, is obviously fundamental to Amazon and many of the companies that are partnered with you. What are some of the efforts and initiatives that are being taken to try and tackle some of those challenges?
Yeah, Amazon's it's a large company and operates in many hard-to-abate areas of climate. So everything from we fly airplanes. We have a transportation and logistics network around the world. So we're encouraged by the demand signals that are being sent on new fuels like SAF. So within the Climate Pledge, we have JetBlue, Alaska Airlines working together with Neste to increase the supply of SAF and get those into airplanes. We're seeing new fuels and technologies come from companies like Zero Avia, which is working on a hydrogen electric aircraft with Alaska Airlines. So there's some really interesting work happening there. There's a company that I love called Carbon Cure, which is an additive for carbon that helps to reduce carbon emissions from concrete, which is a big emitter. And if you're someone like us who has many buildings and continues to build, is a great solution. None of them are perfect. They won't get you to zero, but collectively being able to bring those companies together, send those demand signals that if you increase supply, we have 450 companies that are lined up and ready to buy those materials from you and need those solutions. So I think there's a power in collaboration, especially in those really hard to abate sectors.
And that power and collaboration really does shine through with what Climate Pledge has got now on its books. I mean, you've got 430 companies across 56 industries in 38 countries. That's really impressive for something that only was set up a few years ago. Are you optimistic around, the future for the Climate Pledge and by extension, therefore, reaching climate goals? And what are you most excited about?
Yes, I am. Maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but I also happen to work for a company that loves hard challenges. This is definitely one. But when we established the Climate Pledge, which I can give a little bit of the backstory to that, Amazon was looking to establish its own net zero commitment. And we threw some numbers around. Science team did a bunch of accounting and looking at things and how fast can we go. And as that process was happening, we had a leader who said, that's not fast enough, you need to go faster. And also who recognized you aren't going to be able to do that if you don't get all of these other players in the game. And so, as a 16-year Amazonian, I found it a little uncharacteristic of the company at the time to set a pledge. We hadn't done anything like that before. I thought, that's, it's kind of wild. Will anyone join? And we weren't sure in the beginning, but what I've learned, even through the pandemic, which is when I started working on recruiting and building the program, that companies are not backing away from climate commitments. They, even during a time when they had to defer resources to a health crisis, oftentimes it was companies who were making goods and services that went to first line workers and whatnot, they were still investing in and committing to climate goals. And that gave me a lot of optimism. And I've just seen that really ramp up in the last few years. And I feel it here at COP too. I don't know if anybody else is feeling that right now. I mean, it may just be the seat that I'm sitting in, but I really feel like people are talking about the importance of the private sector and the ability of companies to deploy that capital, use their resources, and partner with government and NGOs and whatnot to help solve some big problems.
Sally Fouts, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, and I wish you all the best luck for the next 12 months and beyond that. So thank you very much for your time.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Enric Sala, Pristine Seas founder and National Geographic Explorer in Residence, for a conversation with Bloomberg Philanthropy's Anther Williams.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being here and your interest, and thank you so much, Enric, for joining us. Enric Sala, I think you have the greatest title in the world as the Explorer in Residence at National Geographic. It's like the thing that kids would want to grow up and be. So how do you become the Explorer in Residence at National Geographic?
Thank you for having me. Yeah. First of all, it's an oxymoron, because explorers are not supposed to be in residence.
In residence, that's a good point. It doesn't work at all, actually.
Yeah. So I was a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in California. And my job was to conduct scientific research on the impacts of humans in the ocean, impacts of fishing, global warming, and write as many scientific papers as possible and publish them in academic journals. That's how you are promoted in academia. And one day I realized that all I was doing was writing the obituary of the ocean, with more data, more precision. And that day I decided to quit academia and dedicate myself to conservation. I felt like the doctor who's telling you how you're going to die with excruciating detail, but not offering a cure. So I said, forget it, I'm going to work on the cure. And I took a few months off to think about what I wanted to do. And I came up with this idea of going to vital ocean places and help to get them protected. So I knocked at the door of National Geographic Society, and I told them, hey, I have this idea. Let's go to the wildest places in the ocean. Let's get them protected, and let's combine what National Geographic is famous for, exploration and storytelling, with my research experience, and help to make sure these places are saved before it's too late. And that was the origin of the National Geographic Pristine Seas project.
That's so great. And how long have you been at it now?
15 years already. And we've been working with local communities, indigenous peoples, and governments to help create 27 of the largest marine protected areas in the world. And we're continuing, thanks greatly to your support, to the support of Bloomberg Philanthropy. So we'll continue pushing until 2030 to help achieve the global target of 30% of the ocean protected by then.
So I want to talk about that. We're here at Bloomberg Green at COP28, of course, and most of the attention and focus, rightly, is on solving the urgent problem of climate change. Bloomberg Philanthropies, along with many other philanthropic foundations, announced big new commitments on bringing oceans and climate closer together and supporting the advocacy and campaigning to make that happen. But why should people who are here, who are primarily focused on climate or energy transition, care about protecting the oceans, care about 30 by 30, care about the questions of biodiversity and nature?
Well, first of all, can I say something about how ridiculous it is that now the ocean covers 70% of the planet, and if you go to the blue zone, the pavilion where the ocean, the building where the ocean pavilion is the farthest away. It takes 15 minutes walking from the entrance, and it's the tiny pavilion at the very end corner of the building. So the attention that is given to the ocean is really disproportionately low to its importance. Everybody sees the ocean as a victim of climate change. The ocean is warming, acidifying, but it can also be a solution. And I like to show one example, but everything that is good that we get from the ocean, food, oxygen, carbon sequestration, depends on marine life, from the microbes to the whales. It is microbes, bacteria, very small bacteria that we only discovered 30 years ago that produce 20% of all the oxygen that is produced on Earth. And it is all the animals in the ocean, like whales, like these sperm whales, that help sequester carbon in the ocean. And you have seen these whales. You have been in the water with these whales. And this is, I love to share this story. This is the government of Dominica in the Caribbean. 2 weeks ago, they announced the creation of the first sperm whale reserve in the world. This is an area where the threats to the whales are going to be eliminated. No ship traffic, because these whales are declining. This is a resident population of sperm whales, over 200 that live there. And when you jump in the water with these whales, the first thing they do is flight clicks, you know? And this means I'm from Dominica. You know, there are different families of whales, different clans that have different dialects, and this is the way they introduce themselves. And you can feel, you can feel these clicks on your bones. So it's incredible. These gentle giants, they are bigger than school buses. And the government has decided to create this reserve because the population is declining, and they want the population to bounce back. And they do something incredible for climate. They are mammals, so they have to breathe at the surface, but they go down 1,000 meters to hunt giant squid. They are down for one breath, 45 minutes. Total darkness. Can you imagine the epic fight of these giants and the squids? And we saw one sperm whale with a filament out of the mouth, and we thought, oh no, it's a fishing line. Actually, it was a giant squid tentacle. As long, it was the remainder of the meal, as long as the sperm whale. Okay, so the whale go down, eat giant squid, so that nutrients from the deep, they come to the surface, they breathe, they rest, and they defecate. And the whale poop, actually, is very rich in nutrients that they bring from the deep. It's rich in iron, it's rich in nitrogen. And that poop fertilizes the surface waters, and that creates blooms of plankton, these microscopic algae that live on the surface. And these microscopic algae, they are plants. They capture carbon dioxide from the water and the air, and they release oxygen. And they bloom when they are fertilized by the whales, and they capture a lot of carbon, and when they die, many of them sink to the deep sea with the carbon in it. So that's the way these whales help to capture carbon. And in the case of Dominica, these 250 wells sequester as much carbon every year as the equivalent of removing 6,000 cars out of the road, which globally, or for Dubai, is not much, but for a small island nation in the Caribbean, it's significant. So this is a way that marine life can help with climate benefits.
I feel confident that no one here thought they'd come into this session learning that whale poop is a important climate solution, but now you know, and you heard it here first. You know, we read about so much bad news in oceans and climate. You know, there was a study a couple years ago saying, just based on the amount of plastic pollution in the ocean, each person eats a credit card's worth of plastic a week in their food. We hear about, you know, important ecosystems disappearing, the ocean's heating, losing coral reefs. What are the real practical solutions you see, and what gives you hope?
Well, that's the good news. The bad news, I'm not going to repeat the bad news, everybody knows, but we are taking too much out of the ocean and using it as a toilet, basically. But the good news is that, and this is what we are working very closely with Bloomberg Philanthropies, is to scale solutions that work. And if we want to restore all the benefits that marine life gives us, we need to restore marine life. And the best way to restore marine life is not to kill it, right? Seems like an oxymoron, like a no-brainer, but still people debate, you know, how we should manage this and that, you know, just really not thinking about efficient solutions. And what we work on is the marine protected areas where there is no fishing. Fishing is the last large-scale hunting operation on the planet. There is no harvesting in the ocean. We're just hunting fish. And we're killing them faster than they can reproduce. So areas with no fishing, no mining, no oil drilling, no development, areas where marine life can come back. And I want to show you an example, because images are better than words. This is a place in Mexico, in Cabo Pulmo, in the mid-90s. The local fishermen were so upset with not having enough fish to catch. They realized that it was because of their overfishing. So they decided to ask, they partnered with some scientists, and they asked the Mexican government to create a no fishing area, a national park in the sea of 70 square kilometers. And we were there in 1999 to see what was there. And then we were planning to come back in the future to see how marine life would recover. As you can see, this is an underwater desert. There is not much life there except for some encrusting sponges. You cannot see many fish there. So they closed the area to fishing, and we came back 10 years later, and this is what we saw. This is the same place. Before and after, the same place. We saw it come back from desert to pristine, a kaleidoscope of life and color. And even we saw the return of the large predators like sharks and jacks and groupers. And you know who else is thriving now? Those visionary fishermen, who now they make so much more money taking divers to see what they cannot see anywhere else in North America. And these places are tourism meccas. I come from the Mediterranean, from Spain, and there is one place, the Medas Islands Marine Reserve, is just 1 square kilometer protected. And that's 1 square kilometer protected maintains 200 jobs of people who take divers to see that marine life, and that generates 16 million euros. 1 square kilometer of sea generates 16 million euros. Not only it generates employment and economic revenue, but these fish in these reserves reach sizes, enormous sizes, that you cannot reach in anywhere else. If you keep fishing, it doesn't matter how well you manage it, you will never allow the fish to reach these big sizes. And these big females produce, they are huge, they produce a disproportionately large number of eggs. So they send eggs outside of the reserve, of the protected area, and they help to replenish the areas around. So actually what we have seen is that there is more fishing around these no-take areas now than before, when the fishermen were fishing all over the place. So this is like an investment account that with a principal that we set aside that grows with compound interest and produces these returns. So these areas are triple wins. And this is why we are so excited to work with you and our partners on these solutions, because they know it work. We know they work. We just need to scale them.
It's an amazing story that it's even with all the destructive activity that it can come back so powerfully.
Yes.
And your model with Pristine Seas is really a specific kind of campaigning, which is you inspire the decision makers to do the right thing, as you did in the case of Dominica. Can you say a little bit about how you do that?
Yes, well, when I was in academia, I thought that information, data, was all was needed for decision makers to make rational decisions, right? I was thinking like an economist. And then I realized that no, actually we need to touch the heart first. So we go to these places, and when we can, we bring country leaders with us. We have taken presidents in submarines. President Duque of Colombia, he's here, and he's telling everybody the story when he came with us to the coast of Colombia in the Pacific, got in our submarine, and he came out transformed. He said, wow, I had no idea about how powerful the sea is, how wonderful. We need to protect these places. And they went from 16% of their waters protected to 32%. They doubled the protection. And so first we want to make sure that the leaders and the local leaders also, local communities, they see the sea with different eyes. They fall in love with their seas. And when they fall in love with their seas and commit to protect them, then we come with scientific research, the economic research, the policy recommendation. But it's first heart and then the brain. And what have been some of the cases that you've seen the most success? The most success, Cabo Pulmo is one of them. We've worked with countries to create 27 of them. But there is one place that is really, really unique when it comes to protection yielding climate resilience. And this is the first place actually we went to with Pristine Seas, in the Southern Line Islands in Kiribati. Uninhabited islands, 5 uninhabited islands. This is in the middle of the Pacific between French Polynesia and Hawaii. We found this pristine coral reef. Most of the bottom was covered by live coral, sharks, lots of fish. And the government of Kiribati protected it in a no-take area, in a marine reserve. But in 2016, the Pacific experienced the strongest marine heat wave, the strongest El Nino year. And what happened in this pristine place? It was protected, nobody was fishing there, but a protected area cannot make the water cooler. Half of the corals died. So these are dead corals covered by encrusting algae. But we thought, well, it's a disaster that the most pristine coral reef archipelago has lost half of the corals over a summer. So this is the future for coral reefs. But we thought, well, this is the place with the highest biodiversity, the highest abundance of fish. If there is one place where biodiversity, where marine life can help a coral reef come back, it has to be this one. So we waited a few years. Of course, COVID made us wait. And in 2021, we came back to see what was happening, because nobody ever goes there. So it's a very remote place. And we had no idea if the reef was recovering or the reef was half dead or more than half dead. And I remember getting there the first day, jumping on our Zodiac. I was so afraid because we didn't know what we were going to find. And I remember my buddies were getting their tanks ready. I couldn't wait. I just jumped in the water, and this is what I saw. It had come back completely. It is the greatest coral recovery ever witnessed in the world. And we couldn't believe it. And the corals were growing faster than what anybody had seen anywhere else in the world. And why is that? Why did this reef, why these are super reefs, why did these corals recover? Well, because it's protected and fish are off the charts. You have sharks, you have groupers, snappers, damselfish, and then the parrotfish that eat algae. So you have these big fish that you can find nowhere else that kept the dead coral skeletons clean, and that allowed the remaining corals to replenish the rest. So it is the fish that enables the corals to come back. It is the protection, the marine protected areas that provide resilience, foster resilience for these coral reefs. So this is why, again, I think you can tell how excited I am about this. But it is the protection that yields resilience to climate. So we cannot, these areas allow us to buy time while we reduce emissions.
One of the things that we've worked on together is identifying the coral reefs that, the portfolio approach to coral reefs, the 50 reefs around the world that stand the best chance of withstanding the warming that's already happening in the ocean, and also that are geographically connected so they can repopulate the world's reefs as we stabilize climate. What sort of policy change or regulations do you need governments to do? Like, what was the key to success in this amazing case in the Southern Line Islands, which did, by the way, make the cover of National Geographic magazine with very beautiful pictures that everyone should look at?
In this case, well, there are several factors that influence the protection. In some case, it's the economic argument, like in Cabo Pulmo or the Medes Islands in the Mediterranean, is the promise of tourism, which is realized pretty quickly. In other cases, is the increase in fisheries around it. In this case, and in other cases, it's the need to protect, the understanding by the leaders that they own something that nobody else does. These are very fragile places, very rare. And it is actually pride, because Kiribati is a country that you hear, oh, Kiribati, Tuvalu, these countries, they are going to disappear under the waves. They don't want to disappear under the waves. The government of Kiribati says, no, we want to be resilient. These are the most resilient coral reefs on the planet. This shows that the corals can keep up with sea level rise in these places if the fish biomass is so high, if the reefs are really, really protected. So this is really buying time. So it was a combination of the pride of having the most wonderful place in the ocean, but also, in this case, the climate resilience factor.
That's such an important point. I don't think people necessarily realize that connection, that if you get the government to set a marine protected area, allow the fish populations to come back, that helps the coral reefs stay healthy, regrow in the cases where they're bleached, and then that provides climate resilience for the structures on land in these places as well. Take a moment and tell us about your book.
Yes, during COVID, I published a book called The Nature of Nature. And I was planning all these book events, etc., and I couldn't do any because we were all locked down. But The Nature of Nature is my love letter to nature, is an attempt to explain to business leaders and country leaders and anybody interested in nature why we need all of nature. Why do we need all of the species, from microbes to whales, out there for our survivals and for our economy? And what's the link between also the pandemics, diseases, and our destruction of nature? So for me, it's like a crash course of ecology for bankers, for business leaders, for country leaders, for mayors, with stories showing why we need nature, why we cannot survive in a planet with all the species and as many individuals of each species.
That's great. So check it out, Nature of Nature by Dr. Enric Sala. Enric, thank you so much for your leadership and everything you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ahmed Wani. I'm the co-founder and CEO of One Concern. And by the way, if you guys have questions, please feel free to submit them, and we'll take them at the end. Over the last 12 months, US corporates have experienced around $100 billion in uninsured business interruption losses, primarily triggered by weather events. Now, just think about that. And now, in the same 12 months, every company, every corporate, every asset owner, every asset manager, every bank in the US which did a climate risk disclosure for physical risk got a green report card. And at the bottom of the report card is one of the audit firm's stamp saying, no materiality, right? So there is a reconciliation gap today of $100 billion between actual impacts of climate change and climate risk versus what we are able to measure / disclose. Now, if you look at these 5 properties on the left, none of these are in the flood zone, right? The blue is the actual flood zone. So through kind of conventional technology, which is what we call as GIS technology, where we take a flood zone, we upload our locations, we check whether we are in a flood zone or a wildfire zone, hurricane zone, etc. All of them will get that green light. But actually, if you actually were to consider their surrounding environment, their power outage propensities, their supply chain, their customers and employees, none of them are anywhere close to a green check mark. In fact, their actual losses in the last event tell you a completely different story, right? And so status quo is a large corporate, let's say they have 10,000 locations, uploads all their locations, and invariably they get answers like, hey, only 1 location is in the flood zone today, and only 3 will be in the flood zone 30 years from now. And then the auditor asks them, do you guys have insurance for these 3? And they're like, yeah, yes. And then they get that green check mark, right? And actually, and this is not just a large corporate. In fact, 90% of US commercial facilities today are not in any high hazard zone. This number becomes more than 99.6% when you consider the Fortune 500. The Amazons of the world and the FedExes of the world do not build in flood zones. But 95% of them have their businesses impacted because of externalities, while their buildings are not touched by a drop of water. These include power outages, supply chain disruptions, employees and customers being affected. So the business inside the facilities is affected while the buildings are just fine. Today, we are able to, through technology, data, and AI, capture around 90% and account for around 90% of that reconciliation gap. So, we had our work cut out for us, which is the risk is in the infrastructure, right? It's not just the facilities, but actually the broader infrastructure. And so we started to actually go and map this out, right? We started with small cities where we started to collect this data. What does that crane look like? When was it upgraded? What about that power line? What about that substation? What about that highway? And at some point, we were able to gather so much data that we were able to train an AI model on how cities are built. So essentially, just like ChatGPT trains and then generates synthetic language, we are able to generate synthetic infrastructure data. And we were able to start to fill the data gaps within smaller cities to begin with, where we were generating an adjacent street. And then we went on to generating, an adjacent city. And at some point, just like, there is a moment when you first are comfortable driving to your home or driving to your school when you first get your driving license. And at some point, you learn how to drive. And that moment happened for us last year when we were able to train AI on how cities are built and essentially generate a synthetic digital graph mapping out every power line, every transportation network for the entire US. Now that you have this graph, what do you do with it? So you hit this graph with any kind of disturbance, whether it is happening in the next 3 days or whether it's happening in the next 30 years, right? And now you see ripple effects, second, third, fourth order effects. Now we measure risk in one single language, time. Everybody wears a wristwatch, so everybody understands the concept of lost time. So essentially, now, for the first time, you have millions of data points in terms of power downtime, highway downtime, bridge downtime coming to each facility. And now you, instead of telling a bagel shop, you are in a 250-year flood zone, and they don't really know what to do about that, or how to even grasp that information and translate that to impact to business. For the first time, they are able to get information like, over the next 1 year, you're going to have 10 days of no power and 3 days of no foot traffic. That suddenly is very actionable information, perhaps not for the bagel shop, but for a bank which has provided them a credit line. Now, if you replace the bagel shop, same address, with a data center, nobody's visiting. But they do require thousands of gallons of water per day to cool the data center, the servers. And so they are worried about reliability of water. And so for each industry, we are able to measure, quantify crucial downtime metrics, which then ultimately are linked to cash flow. So essentially, now that you have, for the first time, linked physical risk to time, and then translate that to cash flow, what can you do with it, right? So these are some cases where, this is 1,000 commercial mortgages in the Miami region. So we took flood and wind risk on these commercial mortgages, and what we were able to plot was the probability of default for these mortgages. Now, what we see here is if you took the direct property into account, or if you took a forward-looking climate model, but just the direct property in green into account, you don't have much defaults. But now if you take the dependencies into account, those increase. And by the way, facilities, as I mentioned, are already insured. So this is the insurance when you apply insurance on top of it, right? Insurers only cover your building. Once your building gets affected, that's when they will give you a little bit of business interruption. But that doesn't really happen, as we discussed. So essentially, this becomes this in 5 years, and this in 10 years. So essentially, this is that $100 billion of unpriced risk today, hidden in plain sight, right? So I wanted sort of everybody to be able to experience this. And so if you guys are interested, whoever sort of is able to point their phone and at this QR code, and just press next. What you'll be able to sort of see is you can pick one location or one company name, and you'll be able to actually simulate this digital graph for one location. And it'll show you those hidden risks which are today not priced. Questions?
I have one to start us off. How do we model or account for possible AMOC collapse?
Sorry?
How do we model or account for possible AMOC collapse?
What is that? Sorry.
I don't. That's what's submitted. Anagram for, yeah. Anybody who submitted it? No? Okay. Okay. I don't know. That's all we got.
Okay. Okay.
Great.
Any questions on the demo?
Questions come through me on the online. Yeah,
okay.
I ask them. Yes.
Oh.
So that was the one that we had. So yeah, that's it. You can wrap it up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please welcome to the stage John Anger, climate and energy reporter at Bloomberg, and John Freyer, senior executive editor at Bloomberg, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Sharon Chen.
Hi, John and John. So we've been here for 4.5 days now. It's just time to maybe take stock of what's been going on and kind of pick your brains on what you think are the biggest things that have happened so far. John, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think obviously the first 2, 3, 4 days were sort of like shock and awe in the sense of the dizzying scale of the announcements that we saw. I think especially on Saturday, it was so hard to keep up with everything that was being announced. So we had the methane deal, we had the deal on loss and damage, we had the oil majors, again on the methane deal, coming in and saying that they were going to take part of this. Announcements on accelerating industrial transitions, etc. So I think it was $57 billion the presidency claims and new money has been pledged. So you would expect, this was a very sort of concentrated PR effort, and you would have thought that there would engender a mood of optimism going into sort of the difficult negotiations that lie ahead. But I've also been struck by also the subtext of rancor, almost. I think there is still a lot of suspicion out there about the oil companies. I think, possibly not helped by the CEO of Exxon giving an interview where he said, I've come to COP and I think renewables have been talked about way too much. At COP, of course, we saw those controversial reported comments by the president about climate science and net zero, et cetera, which he's just rebutted in a press conference. So there is also this sort of countervailing mood of suspicion, I think, in the background. So it's sort of certainly, I mean, from a journalistic point of view, it does suggest that the next 10 days of this COP will be perhaps a little spicier than we were expecting at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, obviously just even coming into it, the fact that the UAE is hosting COP has been a major narrative for the whole year before we even got to Dubai. I mean, John Angel, you are in the rooms talking to negotiators, figuring out what's happening on the ground. What's your take on how we're being set up for the fight at the end of the conference?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that when COP started on Thursday, it really got off to a flying start. One of the key issues going in was on loss and damage. This was a big issue that had kind of pitted developed versus developing countries. And for the first time after 3 decades last year, an agreement was reached to set up this fund, but it still remained controversial going in. But the UAE presidency managed to solve that on the first day, which was a major victory, and we already saw about $500 million of pledges going into that loss and damage fund. So I think that was a key victory, as well as a lack of agenda fight. And as John already mentioned, there's been a swathe of important announcements, a lot of money thrown in by the UAE. But this is the point of the process where we really get into the negotiations. We've already seen several hours of negotiations on mitigation, on how to cut emissions. That's going to carry on this week before ministers arrive later this week and take it into the second week of negotiations. And that's where I think we're really going to see a fight over things like a fossil fuel phase out or a phase down, and how countries need to come back and produce their plans for 2035, how they're going to cut emissions across their economies and all greenhouse gases in order to close that gap from 2.9 degrees this century to 1.5 as outlined by the Paris Agreement.
And we all know every single word, every single comma in that document is just so crucial because it kind of sends this global signal of what everyone has agreed to. So the language that we're talking about around fossil fuels is the debate really whether or not it's orderly or rapid, and then whether it's unabated or not abated. Do you want to break down those two distinctions?
I think the first question is whether it makes it into the text at all, of course. I mean, for the first time we saw coal put into the text at Glasgow 2 years ago, and now countries want to expand that to oil and gas, but there is a lot of pushback there, so there's a number of different ways this could unfold. We could see it in there. We could see the likes, well, we're already seeing the likes of Saudi Arabia really pushing for carbon capture and storage to put that language in there in order to phase down emissions, for example. That's something we could see. We could also see a push by China to say that they need to see a real sequencing, so a phase up of renewables before any phase down of fossil fuels. We could also see developing countries say, well, developed countries have to phase out their fossil fuels first before we have to. So there's a number of different linguistic things. Each will have a different signal for business and investors, I think.
And also, I forgot to say earlier that we have a QR code that has been up on the screen at times during this conference if anyone has any questions that they want to submit. Aside from the final communique and all this debate about fossil fuels, another major issue is adaptation. It doesn't get as much attention, but the hottest year on record, we've already seen how damaging and scary the extreme weather is and how unprepared countries and communities are to deal with that. We, on the Zero podcast, Bloomberg Green's Zero podcast hosted by Akshat Rathi, spoke to the CEO of the Global Adaptation Goal, and his main concern is that everyone just isn't paying enough attention to it, and it's so much harder to figure out how we set targets for adaptation. On Bloomberg Green, we have spent the year really focusing on extreme heat and how cities around the world are adapting to that. And we have a video of some of the stories that we did that we would like to share.
ધંધા પાણી માટે તકલીફ થાય, ગરમી બહુ પડે, એવી રીતનું બધું અમારા હલનચલન થાય.
La calidad de vida empeora un poquito, se duerme mal.
There is a dangerous situation in the city.
Just like a fireman, we're ready to go as soon as we get a call. Everything that does go up eventually comes down.
Women like Kunwar face a dilemma: stay home and lose a day's income or brave dangerous conditions to earn a living.
On the outskirts of Seville is Cartuja Canat, a $5.6 million project designed to cool the area by around 18 degrees Fahrenheit.
Aquí esto, digamos, todo se basa en generar agua fría, que luego se utiliza para generar aire frío.
The UAE is putting a lot of efforts on rain enhancement fields.
Cloud seeding can actually increase up to 23% of the rainfall.
If the conditions are just right and you kick it with a flare, if you circle around it, it's starting to rain already.
We've devised an insurance that when the conditions are too dangerous to work, they receive a supplement for their income to their bank accounts.
From shade to climate shelters and high-tech solutions, whilst the city is taking steps to address extreme heat, much more needs to be done to keep people safe.
So that's just a few of the stories that we've done over the year, and obviously adaptation is something that everyone repeats needs to be really put much higher on the agenda. I mean, John, you were a huge supporter of this series and our work. What really struck you about it?
Yes, they're great. You should all watch them. They're on the Bloomberg Green website. And I think it was really, I mean, you're right, adaptation is not talked about enough, and you know, whether we like it or not, the world is getting hotter, and the world, we are going to adapt. We're going to have to adapt, and I think, you know, we went to 4 cities. There was Seville, Amman, Masdar City, just down the road, and Ahmedabad. And you know, you watch this and you just learn all of these interesting techniques that the rest of the world is going to have to cities around the world are going to have to learn. I think my favorite one actually was from Seville, where we sort of talked about some of the ancient sort of cooling technologies that have been used in that city, like aquifers under the ground, etc. The use of shade in Masdar City, and you actually I was sort of struck actually walking around the blue zone as well. Like, you know, when you're lost in there, you might as well enjoy it. But you know, they also use shade very, very effectively there. So you know, they really sort of. It's very thought-provoking. It sort of gets you thinking about the challenges that unfortunately we're all going to be facing in the years and decades ahead. Para-insurance, that's a really interesting one. Parametric insurance, where the women in that documentary were compensated. They all work outside, and if the temperature reaches a certain amount or breached a certain threshold for 3 days in a row, they were compensated. They were given a financial compensation for that, and I think that kind of insurance, for example, I think Spanish olive growers and vineyards are looking at it becoming an increasingly popular and interesting area of insurance that we're going to be writing about a lot more next year. So yeah, please check out the video series.
So now we want to take some questions from the audience. Abby, I think you have some that came in.
Yeah.
A couple of questions coming in. The first one is, where do you think countries will land on fossil fuel phase out at this COP or possibly the next one? Are countries feeling the pressure on not just phasing out coal, but all fossil fuels?
I can start on that. You can go into the nitty-gritty details. But I mean, my personal view, and again, this is just my view. I mean, I think the energy security question is front and center after the invasion of Ukraine, and it's just going to remain front and center, I think, for a long time to come. The cost of living question is going to remain front and center, and unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your political viewpoint. I mean, I think the pushback on net zero around the world is going to get stronger and stronger. So I think for governments coming here, it's just going to be really difficult to, to come here, and even if you believe in in signing a phase out of fossil fuels, just taking that home and to your electorates and walking through the consequences of that. So my own view is that it's going to take a long, long time before you get a consensus of every government around the world agreeing to a full phase out of fossil fuels in a COP communique. But John, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be language on fossil fuels within the text. I think especially after the various controversies that we've seen on reports about Sultan Al-Jaber and his views on it, I think that's putting pressure on him to make sure that there is some reference to it in the final decision. I think unabated will certainly be a word that's in there. I think even developed countries, the EU, in its negotiated position, it has the word unabated in there, so it sees a role for carbon capture and storage only in the most hard to abate sectors like steel or cement. Obviously, the likes of Saudi Arabia will be pushing to apply that also to the energy sector, so I think we'll see that in there. What will be also interesting is whether coal is specified individually. We know there's a push to have a commitment to have no new coal, which would obviously be a very important signal. But I think also what will be important to see is what kind of stages are laid out. We know from the EU's negotiated position, I work in Brussels, that they would like to see language about fossil fuels being phased out of the power sector by the 2030s. So that could be something. And obviously, given the controversy on Sultan Al-Jaber, I think there will need to be some signposts to make sure that fossil fuel producers in particular don't keep producing more.
All right, we have another one. This one is on climate tech. What are some of the climate tech solutions that seem most promising?
Well, I think I don't know if we can go back and rewind and look at presentations, but John Moore from BNF gave a very interesting presentation earlier. I think some of the key takeaways there are that obviously wind and solar are here, and the supply chains are very elaborate and long established and are now sort of, incredibly cost effective. But, the big question, the climate, as you heard, and Akshat was talking about carbon capture. Carbon capture, obviously, we're going to be hearing a lot about it. John was talking about it just a moment ago. But it is fiendishly difficult to get carbon capture to work at scale and economically. Every carbon capture facility is different. Unlike a solar panel, which is just a cookie cutter, you make millions and millions of them. Carbon capture facilities are very, very difficult to get up and running. The track record so far is spotty. And the other important thing about every carbon capture facility being tailor-made is you can't scale it up, right? So with solar panels, when you make one, you can make 1 million, all exactly the same, and that brings the price down. Much harder to do that with carbon capture, but there's green hydrogen as well, sort of similar questions, possibly slightly easier to do. But I think those are the two, right? Carbon capture and green hydrogen are the sort of the two big ones that we need to crack. We've cracked wind and solar, now hydrogen and carbon capture.
I think also things like food, green cement, green steel, like those things are all really progressing, but they are just not as interesting sometimes, I think. But yeah.
Would you like to take one more?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Is there more that business can do to increase the pressure for positive and ambitious outcomes in the blue zone negotiations?
Well, the oil and gas industry is certainly trying to influence things.
Yes. Yeah, I think for sure. I think methane is a particular area where we've seen business push since Glasgow. That was a big push by business. It was identified quite recently as one of the most potent greenhouse gases, and the effect of reducing it was seen as quite it's a recent phenomenon, and it's already seen huge actions. We've seen it in the announcements today that a number of companies like Exxon, Aramco, they're now pushing to curb methane. So I think that's one area where we've really seen a lot of progress made. Yeah.
There was a question here. If you want to shout out your question.
Thank you. Well, scaling the climate carbon captures, are there any solutions that have been reported here about using maybe nature
So the question, I think, is have there been announcements here or discussions here about nature solutions to draw? I mean, I don't know if this answers your question, but the one that comes to mind, obviously, is the ongoing conversation about carbon offsets, about debt for nature swaps, the financialization of nature. I mean, it is something, how can we, use finance to protect the existing rainforests? How can we use finance to promote, more forests to be planted to suck down carbon? And I think what I've been struck by, I mean, again, there is the carbon offsets, the carbon markets story is so, there is such a huge shadow hanging over it, especially this year through our reporting and the reporting of others. We saw the collapse of South Pole, which is one of the, one of the most prominent sellers of carbon offsets. There's just so many questions over it, but you come here and everybody's talking about it. Bankers, the policymakers are obsessed with figuring out a way to make carbon markets work, to make carbon offsets work, because governments don't have the money. They do not have the money to spend the cash that is needed to facilitate the energy transition and to help poorer countries. So they're just desperate to find other flows of money going from the global north to the global south to facilitate this transition, and carbon markets is one of the things that they really want to try to make work to do that. But we'll just have to see. We've been talking about carbon markets now for years and years and years and years, and the progress is always very, very slow.
Yep, I think there's more.
Great, we do have more. With 70 plus countries holding elections in 2024, are you concerned or positive about the outcome with regards to continuing the climate fight?
Well, if I take that question from the region I know best, being based in Brussels and the EU, I think the EU has really found itself at the forefront of this political backlash against green policies. We've recently had an election in the Netherlands where a far-right candidate emerged with the most votes and the most seats in Parliament. Much of what's been done there, I think the laws have been agreed, that's been locked in. The question is now whether countries are going to implement it with the speed that's needed to hit goals by 2030. So the EU has laid out a goal to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. All the laws are in place to do that and possibly more, but the question is whether that gets implemented. And obviously, we've got a number of elections in Europe, also in the US. I've been speaking to some people today about their fears in the run-up to the US election and whether any commitments made by the US, particularly on climate finance, get honored. We saw that Barack Obama made big commitments when it came to climate finance, which got rolled back under the Trump administration. So I think there's a very real fear that the election next year could also impact the state of climate finance.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I think the US election next year is the big shadow hanging over this COP.
But like you say, I mean, all these political changes are really putting to the test these legally binding agreements or these laws. Like in the UK, we have the net zero law as well. It's a real test of whether or not these measures can really do what they were intended to do, which is provide longevity in these policies.
And I think also when you look at politics, I mean, it just forces you to remember that all of these things that sounds fantastic when you're at a COP. I mean, COP is a gathering of the elites, right, in many ways. I mean, not solely, but you could argue most of the people here are part of government, business elites, whatever you want to call it. This is really expensive. Getting this done is going to be really, really expensive, and it's going to cost money for ordinary voters. And I think that's a conversation that politicians have not had the guts in many countries to have with their electorates. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think in the elections next year, you're going to see more and more of that coming out.
Sort of dovetailing nicely here, our next question, is there a risk of difficult divide with the fast-growing populous global south stepping a long way back in terms of NDCs?
So the question there, is there a risk that populist
of a difficult divide with the fast-growing populous global south stepping a long way back?
Well, I think you've seen that for years, really. I mean, partly you have the global south saying the rich north needs to help us more and don't blame us you guys did all the polluting in the first place, so why are you getting on our case? But I think you have seen, to be fair to this COP and last year's COP, the loss and damage fund I do think is incredible, politically especially, very, very significant.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to that. I mean, we've seen one big effort to kind of close that gap, which is the JETPs, right?
Yeah,
the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which are agreements made between developed countries and investors in developed countries with exactly the kind of countries you're talking about there. So Vietnam, South Africa, Indonesia, Senegal, and these are multi-billion-dollar partnerships. Some have had more success than others. We've seen that and the idea of them is to basically phase these countries off coal. And they've been a mixed bag so far. South Africa hasn't been going so well, but we've seen Vietnam launch their investment plan at this year's COP. And I think there's more optimism around that. So there are certainly efforts to try and close that gap.
Great, I think we probably have time for one last one. This one is shifting our focus just a little bit. With all focus on various technologies and financing mechanisms for mitigation and adaptation, but is there room for a deeper conversation around lifestyle and behavior change? What role does or should that play in our climate solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it should. I mean, that is one of the most important conversations that we don't talk a lot about that at COP, I think, but certainly a greener living. We have a pillar called Greener Living. If you go to the Green website, that looks at how you and how we can live more, sustainable lives. I do think also the conversation does come back to what I was saying earlier about cost and how much of this, how expensive is this going to be, and people learning to embrace those trade-offs. Going green is going to cost money, and I think it's something that politicians probably have shied away from. But you're right. I mean, I think it's something that always, as I said earlier, these net zero conversations sound great when you're at an international summit, but how are they actually going to be implemented? The way to do that is to have that conversation about lifestyle.
I think the real challenge of that conversation is that, well, firstly, there's the whole history of big oil using carbon footprints to try to pass on responsibility. But that sort of become mingled with the idea that any push to try to encourage people to make green lifestyle changes is some kind of greenwashing or some kind of absolving of responsibility, but that's not true. And I think in the discussion, a very important distinction is that if you live in a rich country, you are most likely in the bracket of income earners who are responsible for the vast amount of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And that's what we try to do in our coverage as well. It's kind of separating that to focus on the people who can afford to make those lifestyle changes and have the access to it and have technologies like heat pumps and solar panels that are decreasing in price and increasingly available where they live. So I think when you think about how much should the individual be responsible, you also have to take into account how much their income is and where and how much they're emitting and what access they have to make those changes. Before we wrap up, just speaking of, the things that we are focused on, John, I think you have something you want to share?
So I hope you enjoy the rest of the Green Summit here. We have another fantastic day we're not finished today, and we have another fantastic day of programming tomorrow. Ordinarily, at the end of one of these summits, I would say how much we're looking forward to seeing you in New York in April. However, next year, the next Green Summit is going to be something bigger, something even better, something called the Bloomberg Green Festival, which we will be doing in Seattle next year. And we will be giving more details about that in the near future. So stay tuned. We're very excited about it. And enjoy the rest of today. Thank you.
Thank you.
From here, possibilities are everywhere. From taking first steps here, to beginning your own wealth journey here. From backing global trade ambitions here, to delivering on that promise here. That's why we're here, in the world's most dynamic markets. A bank that connects potential to possibilities. So, where will you go from here?
Please welcome to the stage Marissa Drew, Chief Sustainability Officer at Standard Chartered, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Anne Kavalerski.
everyone. Thanks for sticking around for our chat now. Thanks so much for being here, Marisa.
Pleasure.
I know we have a lot to cover, so we're just going to dive in. The financial sector has provided hundreds of billions of dollars of mitigation finance directed at the energy transition and technologies to reduce carbon emissions. Meanwhile, though, the adaptation finance gap is widening and now stands at between $194 billion and $366 billion per year, despite the fact that all nations will need to adapt to climate change. So with that in mind, I wanted to start there. Is it important that adaptation finance is understood to be just as critical as mitigation finance?
I think you said it right there when you said your gap. It is absolutely critical. So obviously we see the impacts proliferating all over the world, and this is a very, very real issue for people. Standard Chartered Bank, our footprint is largely in the developing world, so Asia, Africa, Middle East, where these effects are very serious for our populations. In many cases, the GDPs of these countries rely on the ability to adapt, and yet there's not enough capital flowing. And I think historically there was this belief in some respects that adaptation finance was in the purview of governments. It was the government's job, not the job for private sector. And I think we've got to reframe that narrative and make that as high on the agenda as mitigation.
Thinking about the narrative, as you just said, and knowing that we're at COP28 having this conversation, do you think COP28 needs to do more? Do you think more needs to be done here around this? And sort of also, why has this not happened before now? Why is this conversation just sort of starting now?
Yeah, I think given how serious this is, why? And it is the right question. First of all, I do applaud this COP for putting it on the agenda. It is a defined topic, and so it is definitely something that I'm seeing where I didn't see before. 2 COPs ago, adaptation felt like something people wanted to hide in a corner. And you ask, why is that? I've thought about that a little bit, and I have to credit Enric White of the World Economic Forum, who put it very nicely to say that by bringing adaptation into the private sector, it was almost an admission that we were failing, right? Because the whole point of mitigation was to try to avoid the effects of climate change that we're seeing now. And if you bring that onto the table, you're sort of saying we're not getting the job done. But I think we're all here recognizing that we're not getting the job done, so therefore it is really, really important. Just to maybe frame it from an economic point of view, because if you are going to get the private sector to participate, back to my comment about this belief that it was really the purview of government, to get the private sector engaged, we need to frame the narrative in a way that the financial services community and those who act in the finance world can understand that there is a return to be made, that there is a commercial proposition. Mm-hmm. And so we've done a bit of research and put a paper out called The Adaptation Economy, where we tried to express this in financial terms. And maybe one way to articulate this is in the concept of ROI. So our research found that effectively inaction comes at such a catastrophic cost, and that cost will increase exponentially at an exponential rate the higher the temperature rise is or the longer we wait. So math terms would say that if we could just put about $30 billion a year into 12 emerging market economies, these are huge economies in the world, on whose services and goods we rely and we want to buy and have continue. If we just put $30 billion to work, we would save about $380 billion of loss and GDP degradation. So if you put those in classic finance terms, ROI, it's about a 12 times ROI on that investment. Pretty darn good investment relative to many financial instruments, even in a high interest rate environment. So this is what we're trying to get out there and help people understand the opportunity set as much as it is the risk side.
And I can imagine that type of white paper really does set the precedent, or the sort of the urgency around why now, and brings attention to the question of why is it taking so long. So that's wonderful to see.
Math does get pretty ugly as the longer you wait, for sure.
So moving on to the E&S of ESG a little bit, adapting to climate change through investment in resilient infrastructure, secure water resources, protecting coastlines, and other measures do pay triple dividend. That's a little bit of what you were just talking about there. Do opportunities deliver social benefits alongside environmental benefits, and how do they really make adaptation finance more appealing to organizations?
Well, at the heart of all this is people. I mean, it is about people, because climate change, this intersection that, again, I think is much more in the lexicon, is a people issue. We're talking about humanity, but we're talking about real lives. So when I say our markets are deeply, deeply affected, when I talk about the economies that we operate in, a big proportion of the GDP and people's livelihoods might be agriculture or might be fishing. And all of those are at peril, and if we don't have capital flowing to help them to adapt to these realities, and especially, if we keep on the same trajectory, it gets worse and worse, these people will not have jobs. And if the governments in those countries do not have enough capital, which they don't, then we're facing massive disruption, as I say, in our supply chain. So if you want to be self-interested, if you're sitting in the West and you want these goods and services, or if from an emotional and humanitarian side, these economies, the people will have to move. And it really strikes home for me when I go in some of these forums and you will go to a pavilion of an island nation who's underwater and you hear them say things like, my country will be unlivable for my children unless we do something fast. I mean, that's hard to hear. And it's not about only loss and damage. And of course, that's an important topic that's been on the table of COP, but it is actually how do we recognize that with this urgency and this imperative comes a commercial opportunity for that private sector to play. And this is where I think for the investment community, we can also create a nice combination or a nice intersection, or if you want to say a multiplier effect of the E and S, because I do think the E has drowned out, the environmental side has drowned out a bit the S, but very many investors who have that as part of their portfolio and ESG strategy, you can neatly put those two things together in a very complementary way.
Right. And do you think this will help scale up investment towards adaptation?
Well, I am hopeful. So as much as that all sounds like a bad news story, we did a poll of those who allocate very, very large pools of capital. So the negative side of that is that we asked these investment managers and portfolio managers and institutional funds how much of your capital today is allocated to the topic of adaptation. First of all, a lot of those people came back and said, what are you talking about? What's adaptation? So we start there with definitions and what do we mean by adaptation. But those who actually kind of understood what we were talking about basically told us it was very, very little. So that's sort of the outside of the conversation. It was some tiny fraction of their capital pools were headed toward this area. The good news story is that because of putting it on the table at COP and because of good works of many of those who are partnering with to get this on the table and get it defined, 75% of those big pool capital allocators have said that they will migrate more money to this topic in the coming year or years. So that leaves me, I guess, quite hopeful that it's well recognized in the commercial, private, for-profit return sector, not just the government sphere.
Wonderful. And as you mentioned, if we can migrate that capital, economies can be more resilient, which is obviously wonderful to see amidst the changing climate. And kind of thinking about Standard Chartered a little bit in this conversation, what does this mean in practice for a bank like Standard Chartered, especially when thinking about the markets you're in? You mentioned this a little bit before, but Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, where obviously the impacts of climate change are really significant.
Mm-hmm. So as we are a bank that uses our balance sheet to provide lending capital or underwriting capital to our clients in our markets, so a lot of this starts, we are a regulated entity, and our regulators now are very clear. They're asking us to take a whole, hard, deep forensic look at our loan book and understand where that loan book is exposed to climate risk. So therefore, in order for us to do that, we are working quite actively with all of our clients to whom we lend. And we have a whole methodology for how we do that. And as we're going through this exercise with our clients, we can see those very specific areas where they're exposed. So what does that do? That leads us to a place where we can go and engage with our clients on the places where there are hot spots, and we can work with them to say, okay, now how do we work with you so that we can address your risks and make you a better credit for us? So that creates that ability for us to continue to provide capital to them. And if we have our clients then respond to that, it makes it a very easy conversation because they're much better credit risks, and we will want to favor allocating capital to where it is well protected. But also, the more we're getting into this, and we're being very deliberate about this, and I can maybe share with you in the audience, to those of you who are in the capital allocation or financial services arena. What we are trying to do, and I believe this deeply, I've been a capital markets and investment banker in the traditional sense for my whole career. And when I have helped to try to build asset classes, the way you can mobilize capital at scale is when you have a common definition. So back to let's start with the definitions, and a common adopted set of practices, and a belief where you can follow best practice use cases. So we took that as a concept and said, if we're going to try to mobilize this capital in a big way, let's try to start with that definition. Let's crowd in those peers and other partners that can help us define what this might mean to them. So an insurance company might look at this slightly different than a bank versus a private equity fund. But let's come to some sort of common agreement. We'll create a framework, and we've been doing this very actively with wonderful partners like the UN, like the World Economic Forum, and other banks and consulting companies to create a framework for adaptation. Now, I do want to be clear for those who've been at this for a really long time, because there are lots and lots of adaptation frameworks, but most of them were born out of perhaps the humanitarian aid or disaster relief arena, which was either the private sector or the philanthropic sector. We needed to kind of create this framework and bring the good work all together under one umbrella that speaks to the private sector actors. So we've been hard at work doing that, but then beyond that, we're creating a practitioner's guide. So if you are a bank or a financial institution, where can you actually lend or allocate capital into something within the sphere of adaptation that is commercially viable? So whether that is resilient infrastructure. You know, I say things, simple things, and sometimes it just doesn't, until you put it in these terms, people don't, in the private sector, don't think about it this way. This isn't just throwing good money after bad in a challenged place. It is, if you're saying I'm going to finance the new model of the built environment, aren't those the products that people are going to want to buy? You know, the homes that people are going to want to buy are the ones that can withstand storm activity and sea level rise and extreme heat. If we want to have those goods and services be in our trade finance flows, aren't we going to want to finance new models of agriculture and plant species and all the wonderful tech that you're so well promoting, that with precision farming, with crops that can withstand water shortages and so on? I want to finance those. Those make perfect sense. Those are the goods and services people want to buy, commercial opportunity. So what we're doing is we're going category by category in this framework and saying, here's where you could play, depending on who you are, if you're insurance or a bank or whatever. And then maybe we all come together and get this moving in the kind of scaled way that we have been for mitigation.
Wonderful. It's great to hear all about that actionability that you're raising to the topic with that framework. I know we are over time, so thank you again, Marisa, for your
went
time
fast.
today.
Okay.
I know.
All right.
For all that great insight. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. We look to engage.
Please welcome to the stage Tessa Callaghan, co-founder and CEO of Keel Labs, Ronnie Gamson, co-founder and chief commercial officer at BioFluff, Muzaffar Kayhan, CEO of Soktash Textile, and Connor Lynn, co-founder and chief business officer at Protein Evolution, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Meg Szabo.
All right. Are you guys sick of me yet? Thank you. Welcome. So, as some of you might already know, Stella McCartney is definitely leading the charge on sustainable fashion. She is the only luxury brand that has, I have it on here, I'm going to make sure I get it right. She's the only luxury house to never use animal, leather, feathers, fur, or skins. So that's a huge feat. And as many of you might have seen since you've been here, she has a fashion activation down in the green zone that you can see, where they're highlighting lots of innovative ideas and new materials and new processes for fashion. And we are lucky enough to have 4 of them here with us today to talk about their solutions and how they're working with Stella McCartney. So thank you all for being here. We're just going to go through. I want to hear exactly what your innovation is, and we'll start way down here. You feel really far away from me over there. Go ahead, Tessa.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. So I'm the CEO here at Keel Labs, and we are helping the fashion and textiles industry transform into the circular economy by developing and scaling new fibers and yarns that are made from seaweeds. So rather than using and mitigating the systems that we currently have, we're pairing an existing supply chain, the fiber manufacturing and textile manufacturing supply chain, with new raw materials. So for us, that's seaweed, which is able to negate the water, the land use, the chemical usage that really makes the fashion industry so polluting. And so we work with brands like Stella to help them transition into a better, cleaner future.
Great. And I will just stop to say the pictures that you are seeing are actually of the activation that are in the green zone that you can go down and see. So that's what these are that you're seeing behind us. So great. Ronnie?
Thank you for having me. I am the co-founder of BioFluff, and we are the world's first completely plant-based fur as an alternative to animal and synthetic furs and all sorts of fluffy materials. We source our fibers in Europe and then produce completely in Italy. And just like Keel Labs, we work with the brands to provide them an alternative to their materials that is more responsible, sustainable, and nature-derived.
Amazing.
Well, I'd like to call what we do fashion farming, actually. So we're trying to grow regenerative cotton for Stella McCartney and turn it into fabulous fabrics for our lines. And we've been working together for many years, but on this project, on this R&D project, we've been working for the last 5 years almost. And yeah, we're trying to convert farmers in our area to actually try and succeed in regenerative agriculture. So that's the idea. We're trying to build healthy, resilient, and interconnected ecosystems for better cotton.
Amazing. Connor?
Great, thanks again for having me as well. I'm here representing Protein Evolution. We're a US-based biological recycling company, and we're focused on decarbonizing plastic. So our BioPure process uses enzymes as a catalyst to produce the raw materials of polyester. The company's been around for roughly 2 years, but in the past 2 years, we've proven this technology at an initial scale. We've scaled the team to roughly 30 people full-time, and we're in the process of building a demonstration facility for our technology, which will be able to recycle roughly 1 to 2 million pounds of polyester waste per year.
Amazing. All so cool. Let's go through, I guess, the journey of how you started to work with Stella, LVMH, and teams, and like kind of the journey of getting here to COP at the activation. We can jump around a little bit, but I will start again with you, Tessa.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, so we've been in conversations with Stella and their team for quite some time. And I think that really where things began is when we started to really analyze the needs of the industry and our customers, which are brands. And so what we were really hearing is this need for new and better naturals that don't have the impacts associated with our current commodity fibers. And so throughout our process of scale and growth, we were able to get to a point where we were able to work with them and with others to turn our products into textiles and into garments. And I'm very delighted that after many years of development, we were able to show on the runway.
That's amazing.
So we have been working with Stella's team for the past year and been doing iterations on our materials. So for new materials, there really is a need to do this back and forth to perfect the aesthetic, the strength, and really we have a very versatile platform of what kind of materials and furs we can produce. So we've been working with the Stella team to perfect until we got to an aesthetic, a feel, a touch that they were happy with. And we're actually showcasing the first ever piece we've done together here at COP. And this is the first time we're showcasing it. It's super, super exciting, and it's just the start of our collaboration. And both Stella's team and generally LVMH has been super supportive. We are part of their incubator program as well for startups in Paris called La Maison des Startups. And they're all really trying to help us perfect the material to a stage where we can really scale it up and work with all the brands and with Stella to make the material choices better.
And I think it's probably obvious, but she is obviously wearing the BioFuff coat right now, if you couldn't tell.
Yes. So this is one of the prototypes. This is how I do my Paris winter wardrobe. And it's completely plastic-free. It's not made from animal fibers. It's not made from plastic fibers. It is plant-based.
Yay. Muzaffar?
Well, we're kind of plant-based as well, I guess. We've been working with Stella, as I said, for a few years before actually this project started. But on, again, of course, sustainable cottons, but not regenerative agriculture. What we did was, out of pure chance actually, she knows that we're also growing our own cotton to weave into fabric, so she approached us, her team, and Stella approached us and said, would you be willing to try this out, this technique that we call regenerative agriculture? And she introduced us to so many people that helped us out with this project that we could actually start with 5.5 hectares. And this past year, it was 100, and next year, the plan is to go up to 250. And at the same time, what we're doing is, on the traceability side of things, she got the UN involved, and we were successful in building a blockchain to trace this one product that we did this year all together with the Stella team. And well, they're calling it the first 100% traceable garment that was ever made, Snuggle-Log t-shirt. And we're actually showcasing it at COP at the Green Zone at the moment. So if anyone wants to go, they can check it out. And the idea now is to scale this up. Like I said, scale it to the farmers around us and the whole region. And hopefully, the whole world will be in line to do this most amazing, the cotton in the world, I should say.
Connor?
Yeah, we kicked off our collaboration with the Stella McCartney team roughly a year ago, and it started R&D based on the bench, where we in-housed dead stock material, blended material, so polyester nylon, polyester acrylic, dead stock from past collections. We used the Stella McCartney dead stock to move our technology from rigid packaging, polyester, so bottles and food packaging, over to textile recycling. From there, we started to scale up internally, and we're actually here as well debuting the world's first biologically recycled garment made from both rigid packaging waste as well as industrial textile waste. And the industrial textile source that we used actually were strappings that were used to secure international freight shipments in a past life, and now they're on debut in the Green Zone at the activation site.
That is a new one for me. Recycled, say that again, recycled straps from industry freight flights?
That's correct. So these are, fairly thick industrial straps that used to be used to secure 3,000-pound plus shipments.
Wow, that is impressive. All right, so moving to the fashion industry in general, I want to talk a little bit about what kind of lessons could the fashion industry in general learn from this model that Stella has kind of put in place. I know I keep on going in order. Want you guys to jump around, but I do want to start with you down there, Tessa.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think that what's really interesting about the Stella model, and that I think, as you're saying, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned there. So the biggest thing is the ability to work with non-commercially available or scaled quantities of materials. And so one of the biggest challenges with integration within the fashion industry is that they're working on such massive scales. And so when you've created a new solution or a new innovation, being able to work with 2 kilograms, 5 kilograms, 10 kilograms, anything under 10 tons is really challenging. And so being able to test and showcase the viability and desirability of materials in small quantities is key. And then from there, being able to implement and scale that within your line. And so for brands to be able to test things out quicker, to validate them with their design teams, with their sales teams, with their marketing teams, and then give the go-ahead so that companies like ours, who are providing the solutions that the industry is literally asking for, is actually possible. And so this is a great showcase ability, and I think scale is really what needs to come next.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in?
Well, I completely agree.
It's happening.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's good. Well, I want to hear from everyone, so it works. Go ahead, Ronnie.
She's just saying everything that I'm thinking. And Stella is really the champion of the sustainable fashion industry. And the fact that she is always the first one to be working with innovators, and the fact that she's the only one here showcasing one of the most polluting industries at COP, she's the only brand showcasing here, is due to the fact that she is the only one really able to work with innovators, innovative materials that are not yet commercial, not yet perfect, on this journey to scalability, but she's willing to take those risks, to put more of the effort to make something look amazing, even if it's not something that she knows how to work with or anyone has worked with in the past. And this is what all other brands should be learning from, because as Tessa said, this is what really gives us the proof of concept, and then this support is what we need in order to scale these solutions that the industry is asking for.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that they're saying. Stella is in a unique position. She's a fashion designer. She's the first and only one, I guess, that describes herself as a sustainable fashion designer. And she's in a unique position because she's also a celebrity, and she can get a lot of people together. So she got us together, and in the past 2 days, she got us together with so many different people that can be so useful to our efforts in the future, like the financing side of things and getting in touch with different operations around the world. She gave us this stage. We're talking to, I guess, thousands of people at the moment because of her. So, yeah, I mean, we're all lucky to be working with her. We're all lucky that she found us, actually. So, I'd like to thank her at the stage again. Yeah. It's difficult to scale, like they both said. And with the help of Stella and others like her who should be following her example, actually, I think success will come for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe her being the first out gives an example of what others can try to do as well. Anything else you want to add, or do they say it all for you?
No, I think the Stella McCartney brand and team understands what it takes to take a technology from the bench to the commercial scale. They've done it with a number of different innovators over the years, and many brands and organizations have commitments, circularity commitments, decarbonization commitments that come live over the next few years. But many brands right now aren't willing to compromise on cost while technologies are scaling. If you take launching material into space as an example, 50 years ago, it cost 99% more to do just 1 kilogram. In the next few years, even that number is supposed to decrease roughly 30x with the new technologies that are coming to life. Without having organizations support an industry like space travel or decarbonization efforts, it's very hard to reduce cost over time. So having brands and a sustainable innovator like Stella McCartney with a platform, with the knowledge of what it takes to go from the bench to the lab scale to a commercial scale is really important on bringing costs down over time and actually getting these solutions out into the world.
I will take a moment to just take a break and remind everybody that we are taking your questions. I have my iPad up here so I can take them directly from here. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please submit them using the QR code, and I'll just ask them up here. So you have to submit them using the QR code. Yep. And I will ask them up here. So I think this is probably the question for, that everybody has, and I don't know if there's a great answer, but how do we get consumers to take more action and be a little bit more educated about the decisions that they're making? How do we actually drive some real change in the industry? I do think my opinion is it needs to come from the consumer side, because companies can't keep investing if they're not. So how do we get people to make more informed decisions? And I have to do it, but go ahead, Tessa, you're first.
Yeah, I actually want to challenge that a little bit. I think that consumer awareness and proactive education is certainly on the rise, and we've seen a lot of that. However, at the end of the day, it's really the brands and the manufacturers that are responsible for the choices that they're making. And so, yes, it's our jobs to help to educate and promote the work that we're doing, although the action is really needed on the brand side to be able to evaluate their business models, evaluate their supply chains, really understand and take responsibility, because at the end of the day, they're the ones making the decisions. On the consumer side, it's integral to put your money where your mouth is, to do your research, to understand how consumerism in general impacts the planet overall. But I do think that a little bit too much of the onus is being put on the people that have a harder time changing the way that our apparel or our products are getting manufactured. Sorry.
Anyway, no, I'd love to. I mean, I think we just need change, so wherever it can come from. Anybody disagree, agree?
I'm happy to jump in here.
Yeah.
Protein Evolution launched earlier this year a consumer survey. We launched it with Wakefield Research. It was around 1,000 US representative adults. We found that 7 in 10 US adults were not aware that fossil fuels are used, or oil is used, to create most synthetic textiles that are used in clothing today. So polyester, nylon, polyurethane. Those same adults did not want to buy clothing that was made from petroleum. And we also found that those surveyed were willing to pay a premium for sustainable products, whether it's products made from waste, whether it's bio-based, or vegan alternatives. And I think that's really interesting. So there's a clear gap in education.
Right.
People don't know where 70% or so of the clothing in their closet is coming from, where it's being made from. They don't want it to be made from what it is being made from today, but they're also willing to pay for the alternative. So I think that brands likely know this. They are pushing for it, but more needs to happen on the consumer education piece.
Yeah.
I do believe that.
Could it be regulation? Could it be, forcing of communication about how the products are being created? Yep, yeah.
I think it's a lot about, as you say, education. And it's funny, if you look at the food industry, we really know what we are putting into our body, what are the ingredients, where does it come from. But then we don't really think about what are we putting on our body and where does it end up in. There isn't a lot of awareness around materials, not regulations, and not from the consumer perspective. And if consumers need to take action, I think that's the biggest call I would have, is to start understanding what are the materials you're wearing and that you are buying. Because a lot of the time, as you say, they don't understand that fake fur is not better than animal fur, because it's plastic, it's petroleum-based, and you're also, with fur, you're shedding it around. So you're basically putting microplastic everywhere that you're going. But as Tessa said, it is also a lot about the brands and their regulations. Everybody needs to work in this together to change this industry.
Yeah.
I like to look at it from a different angle at the same time. We've been talking about the climate for the past few days very heavily. But we should also take a look at the human side of things because, yes, we're talking about the luxury fashion item, which usually costs a lot to the consumer. But then there is a person there that actually grows this product for the fashion industry who's making cents on the dollar. So there is a huge gap in between the two, the consumer and the provider. I'd like to look at it from that side. So education of the consumer goes all the way down and sees what the farmer is trying to do with minimal income. And the support will be there if the consumer knows how much this is actually taking to be able to do it at the end. So yeah, this is very helpful for us with this blockchain. We can now actually see the farmer, which farm it was grown in, and everything. So it's a hopeful future.
So we are running close to out of time. One last question, I think, for all of you. Being here at COP, seeing all of these, meeting all these people, seeing all of these humans that are here trying to figure out how to address climate action, what would be your one hope or takeaway from this time here? Like, what do you hope is accomplished for you to move forward in each of your businesses? Tessa?
Let's just keep on
keep
trend. I mean, I think the biggest thing that we're hoping for, I guess that I'm hoping for, is to be able to come together and say, okay, what comes next? It's great to have conversations, it's great to educate, and I think as a combined unit of governments, of actors, of corporations, of innovators, we really need to, even just one-on-one, come together and say, okay, next month, next week, next year, this is what we're going to do together, and this is how it looks. And certainly really excited to be having those conversations and actually begin to make the positive change after we've been able to talk about it and educate around it as well.
Well, for me, it's more about bringing fashion to the conversation because I think it's incredible what Sala has been doing and the exhibition we're holding. But it should not be the only one. It should not be the only brand here. It's one of the biggest industries. It should be so much more on the conversation. And this is from regulations to the actual companies and the brands and also the solutions. And the key message I would like is that there are solutions and the solutions are here. We don't need to stress the problem anymore. We need to start combining the solutions, the regulations, and the companies to use and adopt those solutions.
Yeah, that sums it up very well. I think that's a great answer.
I mean, for us, for a fashion-driven company, for us, it's like you said, Tessa, the people that we're dealing with should actually put their money where their mouth is. So at the end of the day, Stella's doing something. She's interested in the results. She's not doing this for PR. And people, other companies, should just follow suit and actually look for results at the end of the day, not just, do this for just for show. That's what I do.
I think something that we'd like to see from this global stage is more coordinated action. There's been a lot of commitments over the past few years and not a lot of coordination between different organizations, between countries, and even if it's small change, it goes a long way, and that can be exponential over time. And so there's a lot we're looking out for, whether it's in plastics, in waste management, whether it's in energy transition, coordinated global action and investment as well is something that we're interested in over the next few days.
Amazing. Well, Tessa, Ronnie, Muzaffer. I'm sorry, Connor, thank you all so much for joining me. And thank you all for joining today for all of our conversations. I would also like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Climate Pledge, First Abu Dhabi Bank, Indiana Economic Development Corporation, McKinsey Sustainability, Mubadala Investment Company, Red Sea Global, and Standard Chartered, and our supporting sponsors, General Motors and Google. And I also would just like to invite you all to join us. We have cocktails outside. Starting now, we'll have it until 6 p.m. out front, so please join for that. And then for those of you who did pre-register for our Climate Cooperative Workshop, that will be up on the 7th floor, again, where the breakouts were before. So you just take the elevators up to 7. And we will start back here tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. with Bridgewater Associates founder, Ray Dalio. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you again then. Thank you.